My name is Iain Ramsay, and I'm a professor of law at Kent Law School at the University of Kent. I'm going to talk about the question, is it good public policy for households not to repay their debts? This question might seem rather odd and indeed provocative, since we assume that everyone pays their debts. Wouldn't the credit system break down if they didn't do so? We might admit cases of exceptional hardship, but we would hardly think of it as a general public policy objective to promote non-payment of debts. My answer to the question is that there are good reasons to have a policy which supports non-repayment of debts, and the credit system won't break down. It may therefore be a good policy to encourage individuals to file for bankruptcy, receive a discharge of debts, and start again. Get what's called a fresh start. I want to talk about how this issue of writing down household debt became an important topic after the Great Recession of 2008, and also about some research I was involved in with the World Bank to develop international norms in this area. The Great Recession was triggered by problems of household debt. The US subprime mortgage crisis resulted in over 4 million homes being foreclosed, and the subsequent austerity left individuals in many countries with what we would call a debt overhang. That is to say, high levels of debt which they had difficulties in repaying, particularly where they had lost or reduced employment. Now, these issues are not simply private troubles. This debt overhang causes problems for economies trying to recover from a recession. Since many economies depend on consumer spending, often financed by credit, and when incomes are not rising, a debt overhang extends a recession. Several well-known economists, as well as the IMF in its World Economic Outlook in 2012, have pointed out that recessions which follow run-ups in household debt tend to last much longer than other recessions. And the IMF, in its contemporary work on structural adjustment in Europe, have persuaded many countries to introduce personal insolvency laws which never existed before, to permit individuals to discharge their debts. Now, let me give you some background on different traditions for discharging debt. Different countries have had different approaches. The United States has, compared with the majority of countries in the European Union, and indeed other countries throughout the world, a more generous bankruptcy system, where individuals can discharge most consumer debts and have a swift, fresh start. In some cases, the process lasts no longer than 4 months. Although this was made slightly harder in 2005, it still contrasts with Europe, where until recently many continental European countries did not recognize the possibility of a discharge of debts for non-traders. For example, in Spain, where the recession hit hard, many homeowners faced the possibility of eviction for inability to repay. If their home was repossessed, its sale would not pay off the debt because of the depressed property prices. They would be therefore left with unpaid balances which they could not repay and which they could not discharge because Spain did not have a law which permitted an individual non-trader to discharge her debts. The absence of such a law may have contributed to direct political action by groups trying to prevent evictions. Even in those European countries which do recognize a discharge, an individual may have to wait up to 5 or 6 years before being discharged. In 2015, the EU Justice Commissioner suggested that one reason for the swifter US recovery from the recession was the existence of the US Fresh Start. And the EU is now pushing for a 3-year limit on the waiting period for discharge of debt. In 2011, the World Bank convened a meeting with other agencies to discuss insolvency issues in the wake of the Great Recession. It concluded that the lessons of the recent financial crisis was the recognition of consumer over-indebtedness and insolvency as a systemic risk for the international financial system, and therefore there was a need to modernize national institutions to address the problem of individual over-indebtedness. It recognized that individual countries might differ culturally in their approach to dealing with debt, but that the increasing globalization of finance and debt posed common challenges which should be addressed. It found that more than half of middle and low-income countries did not have a personal bankruptcy system, which can, as we shall see, play a role in economic development. As a consequence, a working committee on personal insolvency was established, and I co-authored a report with some members of the committee, which became the World Bank report on the treatment of the insolvency of natural persons, which was adopted by the bank in 2013. To understand why the World Bank was concerned about individual over-indebtedness, let me just outline the economic and social benefits of permitting an individual to discharge debts, which we articulated in that report. First, there may be increased productivity. An individual with high levels of debt struggling to pay them back may lose incentives to work because most of her pay is going to her creditors. Or she may go into the informal economy to try to shield income and thus reducing tax receipts. Secondly, a discharge of debts can reduce costs to an individual and to third parties, what economists call externalities. Many studies indicate a relationship between debt and health problems which can be costly for both the individual and the community through health services. By alleviating these effects, bankruptcy reduces costs borne by healthcare systems. A discharge can also reduce family tensions. The benefits of bankruptcy include a prohibition on individual creditor enforcement and individual debt collection attempts, which can become oppressive. A recent study of debtors in the UK under debt relief orders, a process designed for low-income individuals, suggested that the process had improved the mental and physical health and also had a positive impact on the families of debtors. Now, my discussion of household debt thus far perhaps assumes that we're thinking of consumer debt. But in many countries, both developed and developing, many small businesses are run by individuals. And the failure of the business will often go along with the failure of the individual, who will have guaranteed the debts of the business and perhaps given a mortgage on the home to finance the business. Little separation often exists between individual debt and business debt. The majority of small businesses in the UK are financed by personal credit cards. And the transformation of the labour market in recent decades means that many low-skilled employees have been transformed into self-employed service providers. In developing economies, the economy is dominated by small, unincorporated businesses. Providing a method to write down debts for this group with the possibility of an ultimate discharge can permit a business to start again. By reducing the downside risks of business, it can stimulate, therefore, more entrepreneurial risk-taking. An individual in business with no possibility of getting out of debt can feel so hopeless that in extreme situations may commit suicide. In India, a significant issue has been suicides associated with farmers in debt. A bankruptcy law will not necessarily solve all these problems, but to the extent it becomes over time more acceptable to use bankruptcy as a way out, it might make some contribution to reducing social costs. Overall, therefore, we might say that a bankruptcy discharge can protect against the possibility of an individual becoming economically and socially excluded, and can enhance economic stability and promote economic development. Bankruptcy, of course, also has effects on lenders. There is the traditional role of providing an orderly method for recovering debts from the non-exempt assets of an individual. Individuals, however, rarely have assets of any substantial amount. More importantly, a bankruptcy discharge forces creditors, financial institutions generally, to recognize and write down bad debt rather than continue to carry it on their accounts. The danger of not admitting that accounts are not going to be collected is that it makes the balance sheet of financial institutions look better than they are in fact, and may lead to a misleading picture of the stability of the financial institution. An effective bankruptcy regime can give a clearer picture of the state of finances. Bankruptcy discharge can also support other credit market policies, for example, responsible lending. A major concern after the recession was that lenders had been imprudent before the financial crisis in over-lending. However, if lenders know that one consequence of imprudent lending might lead to greater use of discharge, there may be more responsible lending. Now, there are, of course, more direct ways of encouraging responsible lending before individuals become over-indebted. For example, when debtors borrow money, creditors can check credit bureau and gather information about individuals' finances, which may be a more effective method. However, bankruptcy law can play a supporting role here. A bankruptcy law that had a very limited possibility of allowing an individual to discharge their debts might have the effect of encouraging over-lending, a form of moral hazard for lenders. But of course, I've given some of the benefits of a bankruptcy discharge. The obvious question is, well, if we make it easier to discharge debts, won't everyone want to use it? Won't individuals run up debts and then discharge them? Won't we face a situation described by economists as moral hazard, where individuals engage in more risky behavior because they know they're going to be protected if things go wrong and they know they can write off the debt? Well, these issues must be taken seriously, but there is little evidence in existing systems that consumers generally think about the possibility of exploiting bankruptcy at the time they are entering into a credit agreement, nor do they generally think about the possibility of defaulting on their debts. But what about the further argument that when people have financial difficulties, they're going to turn more quickly to bankruptcy rather than try and repay? Well, at one level that may be desirable, but in any event, most legal systems contain controls to prevent abuse of the system through, for example, controls on access, the possibility for creditors to object to discharge, the requirement of some income contribution before discharge, or a government agency which ensures that the system will not be abused. Some require an attempt by the parties to reach a settlement of debts with creditors before gaining access to bankruptcy. A more significant problem, particularly in countries where no discharge existed previously, is actually getting individuals to use the system, because bankruptcy continues to carry a stigma. Historically, bankruptcy often brought with it many civil disabilities for the individual, and stigma remains the case even in jurisdictions like England, which liberalized its bankruptcy law in 2002. A study in 2007 by the Insolvency Service found a continuing stigmatization attached to bankruptcy. One method of reducing this, therefore, is through avoiding the term bankrupt in the law. This is what the United States in 1978 did, referring to the bankrupt rather as a debtor, and perhaps using the idea of debt relief in the description of the law. Thus far, I have not put much flesh on the typical debtor who may need bankruptcy. Who are individuals who use bankruptcy in those countries where it is permitted? And what causes them to use it? Well, the most common reasons in international comparisons are change of circumstance, unemployment, other life-changing circumstances. Health costs, of course, are very significant in the United States. A minority have misjudged their expenditure, and a further minority's bankruptcy relates to a failed business. There is, in fact, a group in many countries who not only have no income and no assets, but are unable to pay for access to the bankruptcy process. Bankrupts, therefore, are primarily unfortunate individuals drawn from middle, lower income groups in societies where high levels of debt are almost necessities for the majority of households. Discharge of debts in bankruptcy law is, therefore, I hope I have argued, a useful public policy, but it is not a panacea. Some individuals may have continuing problems associated with uncertain employment and insufficient income, and wider policies are necessary to address these problems. And remember that individuals who go bankrupt will in many countries be listed on credit bureaus, so that it will not be easy for them to obtain credit, and they may face difficulties with financial institutions who do not want their business. Regulation can do something about that, but there are individuals, as I've mentioned, with continuing problems of income insufficiency, where bankruptcy will perform an important but modest role. And finally, of course, a focus on individual bankruptcy may draw attention away from the broader structural economic forces, including economic crises, which trigger debt default, and which are beyond the control of middle-income and lower-income borrowers. Contemporary capitalism is characterized in many countries by increased inequality, where credit is being used by many to sustain stagnating wages, and where high household debt levels are a necessity of life. A bankruptcy discharge could be viewed here as a safety valve, which reduces the potential for broader political protest and dissent. I mentioned the case of Spain at the beginning of the talk. In this light, bankruptcy could be seen as a conservative institution, perhaps, legitimating an unequal system of credit where lower-income individuals pay more for credit than their higher-income counterparts. We should remember that debt and over-indebtedness have always been politically contentious, at least since the secession of the plebs in Rome, or the idea of a biblical jubilee when debts were cancelled every 7 years. Thanks very much for listening.